Thank you for joining us today for our webinar. We're excited to have you with us here. My name is Amy Perkins, and I'm the Marketing Manager for Early Childhood Assessment Tools here at Brooks Publishing. Today's webinar is on using the Teaching Pyramid Observation Tool for Preschool Classrooms, or TPOT for short. We're happy to have the TPOT developers, Lisa Fox, Mary Louise Hemmeter, and Patricia Snyder, here with us today to give us an introduction about the tool. But before we get started, I'd like to go over some housekeeping tasks. You'll be muted for the webinar, but if you have any questions during the presentation, please go ahead and type them into the question box in your GoToWebinar panel, and we'll take these questions after the presentation during the Q&A portion. For best audio and screen quality, you may want to exit any unneeded programs. And so you can have a full view of the presentation, you might want to minimize the GoToWebinar toolbar on your monitor so that you can see more of your screen. And you can do that by clicking that little orange button in the corner of the control bar. And then if you didn't want to enlarge the bar to ask a question, you can just re-click that orange arrow and it'll pop back out. Also, we're recording the webinar today, and you'll receive a link to the recording in a follow-up email tomorrow. And we'll also be posting a link to the recording on the Brooks Publishing website. So now I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speakers, Lisa Fox, Mary Louise Hemmeter, and Patricia Snyder. Dr. Lisa Fox is a professor in the Department of Child and Family Studies of the University of South Florida in Tampa, and the co-director of the Florida Center for Inclusive Communities, a university center for excellence in developmental disabilities. Dr. Fox is engaged in research and training efforts related to the implementation of the pyramid model in early education and care classrooms, program-wide models of implementation, and positive behavior support. She was the principal investigator of the Technical Assistance Center for Social Emotional Intervention, or TAXI for short. Dr. Mary Louise Hemmeter is a professor in the Department of Special Education at Vanderbilt University. She teaches courses, advises students, and conducts research on early childhood issues. She is the co-faculty director of the Susan Gray School for Children, which is an early childhood program for children with and without disabilities. Dr. Hemmeter was the principal investigator for the Center on the Social and Emotional Foundation for Early Learning, or CEFL. Dr. Patricia Snyder is the David Lawrence Jr. Endowed Chair in Early Childhood Studies and the Director of the Center for Excellence in Early Childhood Studies at the University of Florida. She has more than 35 years of experience in early intervention and early childhood as a direct service provider, program administrator, faculty member, and researcher. So we're very happy to have all three of the TPOT co-developers with us here, and I'm going to turn it over to them so they can start with the presentation for the tool. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Amy. This is Mary Louise Hemmeter, and I'm going to start the presentation off, and then Pat and Lisa are on the phone, and we'll jump in and answer questions as we go along. We're thrilled to have so many people on the webinar today and so many people interested in the TPOT. Our plan is to do the presentation, and then as Amy said, we'll address questions at the end of the presentation. So I wanted to start out by talking a little bit, about the background of the TPOT and how we developed it, and then I'll talk a little bit about the structure and how you might use it. So just to kind of provide an overview of the TPOT, we developed this tool as a way of assessing teachers' implementation of pyramid model practices. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but the tool is really designed to measure their implementation of practices at the universal and targeted levels or tiers of the pyramid, and then their capacity to implement practices at the more individualized levels of the pyramid, and we'll give you some examples of those in just a minute. I'm assuming that most people who are on here have some knowledge of the pyramid model, but I want to give you just a real quick overview. So the pyramid model is a tiered model for addressing children's social emotional development and preventing and addressing challenging behavior. The universal level of the pyramid is really about good, high-quality, developmentally appropriate practices, and the practices in this level of the pyramid focus on establishing nurturing relationships with children, and designing classroom environments that promote social emotional development and prevent problem behavior. And so those would be things like how we design our schedules and routines and transitions and activities and those kind of things. At the secondary level of the pyramid, we're really focused on intentional teaching of children's social skills and emotional competencies. And so being really intentional about how we structure and design and implement instruction around around emotional competencies and social skills. We know that even when we do all of those things well that I've just talked about, that we'll have some children in a typical preschool classroom that will be in need of more individualized supports, either around their social skills or around their problem behavior. And so the pyramid model, the top of the pyramid, as we often refer to it, is really around designing individualized instructional and behavioral support plans for children who need more intensive supports. So as I said, the pyramid model, or the TPOT, was developed to measure the fidelity with which teachers implement pyramid model practices. And so we were interested in doing research on the pyramid model, and we needed to have a way to measure whether teachers were doing the practices that were associated with the pyramid model, whether they were doing those practices with fidelity. So the TPOT is really designed to measure the quality of how teachers implement the TPOT or the pyramid model practices. It allows you to compare implementation of the pyramid model practices within and across classrooms, so comparing teachers who maybe have had training on the pyramid model versus teachers who have not. And we also use the pyramid, or the TPOT, and I'll talk about this a little bit later in the webinar. We also use the TPOT as a way of identifying what teachers' needs are related to training and support around the pyramid model practices. So the TPOT, to do the TPOT, you really need both of these things that you see on the screen right now, the scoring booklet as well as the manual. The scoring booklet is the actual protocol that you'll use when you're observing in a classroom to score that classroom. It includes information, it includes space to write information about the classroom in terms of the number of kids and the number of adults. It provides space to write down the schedule of the day, and by this we mean the actual schedule you observe as opposed to maybe a posted schedule. So some of the items that you'll score on the TPOT are related to how much time is spent in different kinds of activities. So the scoring booklet has a space for you to organize the order and length of time that is spent in different activities during your observation. Then, of course, the scoring booklet has a place for you to score each of the items and space to take notes. And so for every classroom you go in to do the TPOT, you'll need a scoring booklet. The manual is really a resource for when you're doing the scoring. So the manual, in addition to having information about how the TPOT was developed and how it's been used in research and the psychometric properties of it, the manual also includes, for each indicator actually, the manual includes definitions, scoring guidance, and clarifications. So it might tell you how often something has to happen for you to score it as occurring or not occurring. It might give you a definition of something that will make scoring it easier to do. So the manual, in our work, our observers always have a copy of the manual with them, but the actual scoring is done in the scoring booklet. In terms of conducting the TPOT, to conduct the TPOT, it involves two primary tasks. One is doing an observation, and one is doing an interview. And so the observations last approximately 2 hours, and during those 2 hours, we want you to observe some kind of centers or free play activity or some type of child-directed activity, at least one teacher-directed activity, so a large group or a small group that's directed by the teacher, and then then the transitions that happen between activities. When we're doing the TPOT, the focus is primarily on the lead teacher's behavior, but we consider all adults' behavior. But we're kind of tracking what the lead teacher is doing in the classroom. Because there are practices or pyramid model practices that are hard to observe, or there are practices that you wouldn't necessarily expect to see every time you do an observation, we have some items that also allow you to score those practices based on interviews that you do with the teacher. And so an example of this is we have items on teaching social skills and friendship skills and problem solving and emotional literacy, and we wouldn't expect that in a single 2-hour observation you would see systematic instruction around all of those. So some of those items will allow you to ask questions of the teacher to score them. The TPOT's organized in 3 subscales. So the first subscale are what we call key practice items that have multiple indicators that you score as yes or no, or no opportunity to observe, which we'll talk about that in a minute. The second subscale are red flags, and again, we'll give you some examples of these in just a minute. And then the third subscale is about using effective strategies for responding to challenging behavior. So most of the other items are around promoting social emotional competence and preventing problem behavior, but this third subscale is really around what strategies teachers use in response to challenging behavior occurring. So the key practice items are the topics or those items are on the page that you're seeing right now, and we've divided them for the point of this slide into items that you score based on observation, items that you can score based on either observation or interview, and items that you score on interview based on interviews only. And I'm getting ready to show you an example of each of these. So this is a key practice item just to kind of orient you to how they're structured. So this item is on schedules, routines, and activities. So that's the item. The indicators are each of the indicators that you see under schedules, routines, and activities. So for example, this item, schedules and routines and activities, has 10 indicators. And for each of those indicators, well, there's the item, there's the indicator, and for each of the indicators, you're going to score yes or no that you see it. So regardless of whether they get 1 or 2 or 3, you're going to score every single indicator under every single item. The arrow here is pointing to the no opportunity. One of the things that we were really explicit about was only allowing no opportunity to be scored when there was a really explicit reason why there might not be an opportunity, and so there's only about 4 or 5 indicators that allow you to score no opportunity. So the example here is that if needed, the teacher prepares children when changes are going to occur within the posted schedule. So if they weren't going to go outside because it was raining, or if they weren't going to have large group because a firefighter was coming or something like that, you could score it as no. That would be an example of a no opportunity to observe. And so if no change occurs during your observation, then you wouldn't expect the teacher to do this, and so then you could score it as no opportunity. That's where you score yes or no, and then there's a notes column. So the key practice item is an observation-only item, meaning everything on this, every indicator on this item is scored based on what you observe. This next one is an item that allows you to score it based on either observation or interview. And so each item, in addition to scoring it scoring whether you observe, in addition to scoring yes or no, you're also going to indicate whether you scored it based on teacher report, which would be part of the interview, or observation. So if you score it as no, there's no reason to indicate, you don't indicate, of course, whether it was observation or interview, but if you scored it as yes, then you also check below each yes whether you scored it based on something the teacher reported in the interview or based on what you saw. So for the items that allow you to score them based on interview, based on teacher report, we give you very explicit questions to ask the teachers, and then you can score it based on how they respond to these questions. We spent a lot of time trying to figure out the wording of the questions such that the wording was explicit enough that people would know what we were talking about, but not so explicit that merely asking the question would help give the answer to the teacher. And so all of our studies that we've done on the psychometrics of this tool have been done using these really specific questions. And so this is essentially a script for how you would ask questions during the interview. The next subscale is the subscale that we refer to as red flags. And red flags are really practices that we think are counterproductive to implementing the pyramid practices. We often think about the red flags as the place where you might start professional development, because these things really could get in the way of doing the pyramid model practices with fidelity. And so here you see some examples of the red flags, and each of these, again, are scored as yes or no. So for example, red flag 21 is children are threatened with an impending negative consequence that will occur if disruptive or problem behavior persists. So the manual would give you guidance for how much that has to happen or to score it as a yes or a no, but each red flag is scored during every observation. The next subscale is the subscale that I was talking about, that's around responding to challenging behavior when it occurs. And so this item can only be scored if challenging behavior occurs. And so for each incident of challenging behavior that occurs during an observation, you're going to score whether or not 3 specific practices happened. And you're going to do that for each incident of challenging behavior that occurs. We have given you, or we've provided, a really specific definition of challenging behavior, and so any behavior that fits this definition that you see on this page would be a behavior, would be an occurrence of problem behavior for which you would score this item. So if you look at this page, this is the actual scoring page for the challenging behavior item. For each incident that happens of challenging behavior, we like to have you write up here at the top of each column just a real brief note about what the problem behavior looked like. And then for each incident, you're going to score whether each of these 3 indicators happened, yes or no. And then your final score for the subscale is based on, did they use all 3 strategies for every incident of problem behavior that occurred. So for them to get a yes, they would have to do that. But you might also score it as no because they didn't use all those strategies, but you could also score it as no incidents were observed. So there was no challenging behavior that met that definition was observed, and so you were unable to score it. The additional strategies that are at the bottom of this page are strategies that you could use in response to problem behavior, but we wouldn't, it wouldn't be the case that you would always use these strategies, whereas the strategies at the top of the page we believe should be used in response to each occurrence of problem behavior. These strategies at the bottom are more specific to specific problem behaviors, and so the indicators at the bottom of the page are not used to calculate the final score, only the indicators at the top of the page. Okay, so we had a question from someone who signed up for the webinar about how was this version of the TPOT different than other versions of the TPOT that people might be using. So Pat, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Just as a reference for people after the call, on page 84 in the new TPOT manual, we actually do a side-by-side comparison of the previous version of the TPOT with this most recent addition. For those of you who have used the TPOT previously, probably the biggest change that you noted when Emma was talking was that there is no more of the 1, 3, and 5 anchors associated with each of the key practice items. And you'll recall that Mary Louise said you score each and every indicator under each item on the measure. So that is one difference between the old version and the newer version of the TPOT. In terms of the items themselves and the indicators, you also may have noticed that we no longer have the 7 environmental items that were on the original version of the TPOT. We actually took 4 of those 7 environmental items and we included them either as red flags or as indicators that were subsumed under some of the key practices on the new version of the TPOT. And we did that primarily because we thought it was really important to explicitly link those 4 environmental items with either the red flags or the key practices that they were associated with most closely. We still, in terms of the key practice items, have 14 key practice items. One major difference in terms of how a key practice item is scored is the collaborative teaming item, which some of you might recall was completed by interview, is now based on observation. And other than that, the minor changes, there are some minor changes in wording to some of the indicators based on our research and based on feedback from our pilot users. And there are also slight changes in the number of indicators that are associated with some of the select key practice items. So for example, in the schedules, routines, and activities item that Mary Louise was showing earlier, we now have 10 indicators rather than 9, which we had on the previous version. In terms of red flags, and the red flags, we have 17 red flags on this version of the TPOT compared to 16 on the previous version. And then probably the biggest change is the subscale that Mary Louise just talked about earlier, and that's the subscale related to strategies used to respond to challenging behavior. So some of you may recall that that was an item on the old TPOT, and we pulled this out and made it its own subscale so that we could address the issues around the 3 essential strategies being used for each incident of challenging behavior, and then also having 3 optional strategies that might be appropriate for use with some types of challenging behavior. And unlike the previous version of the TPOT, we record each incident of challenging behavior, each occurrence of challenging behavior, or each incident of challenging behavior, and the response of the teacher with respect to those 3 essential strategies and any other additional strategies. So those are the primary differences. All of the changes that we made to the TPOT were informed by the research that we conducted on the pilot version that many of you are familiar with. And we hope that, and know from some of our data, that these changes are continuing to strengthen both users' ability to be reliable in their administrations with the TPOT, and we feel like we're getting more informed information using this reorganization of the scales.
Thanks, Pat.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm going to run through a couple of other things pretty quickly here, and then we'll give you all some time to ask questions. So Pat just referred to the research we've done on the TPOT. And I'm not going to go into any detail in this other than to say some main points and then to point you to the manual, which has detailed information about our research described in the manual. So we did a study where we looked at the psychometric integrity of the TPOT. So we were looking at the reliability and validity of it. And so we did multiple observations with the TPOT, 3 observations with the TPOT over a 6-week period of time. And during that period of time, we also did an observation with the class. I think many of y'all are familiar with the class. And the observations were conducted by 2 different people because we were trying to look at inter-rater reliability. I think generally speaking, the findings from this study confirmed that the largest percentage of the variance in scores was due to classrooms, meaning that you would expect different classrooms to have different scores, but there was very little variance that was seen as a result of raters, for example, meaning that the raters were highly reliable with how they scored the TPOT. And the other thing that was really important from these data was about the stability of the scores over time. So across the 3 administrations of the TPOT in that study, the scores were relatively stable, which is a good thing because during that period of time there was no systematic training going on for those teachers where you would have expected for there to be a change. And so what we really wanted to see was that multiple administrations of the TPOT resulted in relatively stable scores, which in fact it did. We also looked at, in this study, at correlations between key practices on the TPOT and the dimensions or domains on the class, and you can see that we got moderate correlations with the class as well as some correlations. Well, those are the kind of the results of the TPOT class comparison, which we did as a part of the study that I was just describing. In addition, we have looked at correlations between the TPOT and the ECHRs and also found some relationships between those items. So we're seeing that there are correlations between items. Of course, you wouldn't expect them to be perfect, but in fact, we're seeing some relationship between the tools. Elizabeth Steed, who is one of our colleagues who does research on program-wide implementation of the pyramid model, has developed a tool called the Preset, which looks at school-wide implementation of pyramid model practices. And she looked at correlations between TPOT items and items on the Preset, and also found some significant correlations there. We've also used the TPOT in our research on where we've been looking at the effects of the pyramid model implementation in classrooms. And so the graph that you're seeing right now is from a study where we randomly assigned teachers to either receive training and coaching on the pyramid model or not. And this is looking at those 2 groups of teachers, their implementation of the pyramid model practices. And so the blue line are the teachers that were in the intervention group, meaning they were teachers who got training and coaching on the pyramid, and the red line represents the group of teachers who did not get training and coaching on the pyramid model. And these data were collected at 4 points in time, starting with the beginning of the school year and going until the end of the school year. And you can see by wave 4 that there were significant differences between the teachers who had been trained and coached on the pyramid model practices and teachers who hadn't. And what's really important our discussion today is less about the findings of the study and more about how the TPOT can be used in studies such as this to not only look at implementation of the practices, but to also look at whether implementation of the practices relates to child outcomes. And so the next couple of slides show you some of the results of the teacher's implementation of those practices on teacher-reported problem behavior and teacher-reported social skills. And essentially what we see is that teachers report, teachers who have received training report their children's social skills to be significantly higher than the teachers who haven't been trained and coached the children in their classroom. And that's for children who we consider to be non-target children, meaning just children that are typically developing and haven't been identified with behavior problems. For kids who teachers report to have problem behaviors, we see a change in teacher report of problem behavior between the groups of teachers who have been trained and those who haven't. This gives you a bit of data on, again, the blue line represents the teachers who were in the intervention group who implemented the pyramid model, and the red line represents the teachers who didn't. And this graph shows the effects on target children, meaning children who have been identified as having problem behavior, the effects of implementation of the pyramid model practices on their social skills, observed social skills. So the last graph was teacher report, and this graph is actually based on observation of children's social skills. I want to talk for just a minute about using the TPOT to inform decision making. We use the TPOT in our coaching. I know that we had a question about that. In our research on the pyramid model, we use the TPOT as both outcome measure, meaning what is the effect of our coaching and professional development on teacher implementation of pyramid model practices. And so we use it as a formal measure of that, but we also use the TPOT in coaching. And so we have the TPOT that is done in our coaching. We do TPOTs on a fairly regular basis where it's done based on that one-day observation, as I described earlier. But our coaches also keep what we call a running TPOT, which means every time they go out, they're updating what they're seeing the teacher do that's related to TPOT items and indicators. And then that information is used to help them set goals and do action planning for coaching around the pyramid model practices. We've also used the TPOT in some of our work around looking at program-wide implementation of the pyramid model, and we think in that kind of a context it can be used as a measure of whether we're doing program-wide implementation well. It can also be used as a way to plan professional development. So you could imagine that you would do a TPOT in every teacher's classroom, and you might identify areas such as, let's say, transitions or supportive conversations where lots of teachers in the building are struggling with that, and so that might be some kind of building-wide professional development you do, but it might also be a way to identify the specific areas where individual teachers might need support. We also think the TPOT could be used in monitoring and evaluation of early childhood programs. So these next couple of graphs are just a couple of examples of graphs that we actually use. This graph would be a teacher's graph on the key practice items from the TPOT, and we actually, I might get Amy to talk about this at the end, but we have a scoring program that will actually print out a graph like this for you, but this looks at teacher scores on different TPOT items over 2 points in time. And then this one, this graph actually looks at a group of teachers. So these are all teachers in a program their scores on the TPOT items at 3 points in time as well. And so you can see how you might look at this graph and say, well, gosh, lots of teachers are doing really great around program-wide expectations, but lots of teachers are having problems around young children with around how you respond to children with problem behaviors. And so you can see how you might use those data to help plan professional development. Okay, Amy, you want to talk about this, and then can you talk about the scoring spreadsheet?
Sure, yes. So how about I talk about the scoring spreadsheet first? So those nice charts that were just up on your screen, the authors have developed a scoring spreadsheet that it's an Excel file that you can use to generate those graphs and to do the automatic calculations of after you do the TPOT observation. So that's available as a free download from our website. So if you go to brookspublishing.com/TPOT, you can download it from there. It's really nice that you can put scores for up to 20 teachers, 3 observations per teacher. And you can get a nice graph for the individual teacher, and then like that last slide you just saw, there's a summary page that'll aggregate all the data from the 20 teachers into a nice spreadsheet that shows you the aggregate data and has a nice chart for you. So that's available just as a free download from our website. If you just, so again, the URL, it's brookspublishing.com/TPOT, and then over in the on that page you can download it. And I can actually I'll put that information in the follow-up email that goes out tomorrow, so you can then just follow up and download that spreadsheet if you'd like. So up on the screen right now, as a thank you for joining us today and listening in, we're offering you a 20% discount on the TPOT, the manual and the forms, or other Brooks products if you're interested in some of our other social emotional resources. The promo code will be in your follow-up email tomorrow, but it's up on your screen now. And so you have until the end of April to use that code and save 20% on the TPOT materials. So I think yep.
Oh, go ahead, Amy.
No, I was going to say I think we're ready for the Q&A portion of the webinar. Is that
Yep.
right? Okay. So if you do have any questions, you can type that into the GoToWebinar panel. There's a question box. I'm going to start off with some of the questions that listeners submitted when they registered. So I'm going to start off with a question about training. One of the listeners asked, what training or credentials are necessary for using the TPOT, and can you use it without formal training?
Well, so we believe that it's important for people to receive formal training. The training that we do generally takes about a day and a half, and at the end of that, a day and a half to 2 days, and at the end of that day of the training, you actually do you watch a video, a 2-hour video, an interview with the teacher, score the TPOT, and then we check you out and determine if you have met a reliability standard or not. We're in the process of working with Brooks to develop a system for accessing that training. I think in the interim, you could contact any of the 3 authors if you have specific questions about training.
Great.
Mary Louise, it's Lisa. There's also a training that's already scheduled associated with the National Training Institute on Challenging Behavior. There's still a few spaces open if people are interested in registering for that. It's in sunny St. Petersburg, Florida.
And this is Amy speaking. I'm including a link in the follow-up email tomorrow, so if you're interested in learning more about that pre-conference session on the TPOT or the conference in general, you can just follow that link to see the registration information.
Perfect. Thanks, Amy.
No problem. Let's see. So I am checking the other questions that are coming in. We have a question from a listener right now who asks, how does the TPOT short form correlate? I think that might be an earlier version, is the short form?
Yeah, so we developed on another project short form for the purpose of that was really for mental health consultants to have something to use in their work. That form has no psychometric, we've done no psychometrics on that form, and so we don't know that it is a reliable or valid measure at all.
Okay, thank you. We also have a couple questions asking how the TPOT relates to the inventory of practice that's up on the CEFL website.
The inventory of practices we actually developed before we developed the TPOT, and so when we were developing the first version of the TPOT several years ago, we actually looked at the inventory of practices and grouped those practices, and many of those practices became indicators that are on the TPOT. We see the inventory as more of a tool for teachers to use, to go to look for really specific practices. So we don't see the inventory of practices as being as much of an observational tool as it is kind of a tool to help teachers identify practices.
Okay, great. Thank you. Scanning through some more questions we received. We have a listener who's asking whether or not the tool's been used with dual language learners, classrooms that have dual language learners in them. I think any of you can jump in if you want to take the question.
Well, I think in our research, this is Lisa Fox, in our research, all of the classrooms that we're working within have children who are dual language learners. There's also an important question that you ask as you enter into the classroom about are any of the children dual language learners, or do any children need information delivered in a different way so that they can understand directions and instructions. And then there are some items that are really specific to making sure that teachers are making those adaptations and making sure, especially on the higher level practice items, making sure that teachers are responsive to the needs of children who need information relayed to them in different formats.
Okay, great. We have a question from a listener and then one that was submitted during the registration. They're asking, they're currently using the old TPOT, and the listener's asking for a timeline when they should be planning to transition to the new TPOT. Do you have a recommendation for when they should switch? Like, I don't know if it's the beginning of the year or if any time's okay.
Gosh, that's a hard question, and Lisa and Pat, jump in here if you don't agree. I think we generally think that the published version of the TPOT is the most accurate and has the most psychometric integrity. And so we think people should be moving towards using that version because the other versions are versions that have not been studied as thoroughly or have not been revised as a result of our work on this tool. I think the reason this is a hard question is because we know, and some of y'all are probably on this call, whole states who have been using the TPOT, and so thinking about how to transition I'm sure is challenging. I guess I would recommend that if you've already collected TPOT data from the fall and you want to look at what changes happen in the spring, you probably want to use the same version you've been using, but I would suggest that you move to the new version as soon as it makes sense to do so.
I would agree. This is Pat, and I would agree with that, ML, and also it might be helpful as you're making the conversion to look at the side-by-side comparisons that we talked about, so you could look at how people might be doing as you're transitioning to the newer TPOT with respect to indicators that are very similar or identical from the older version versus those that have changed.
And this is the other thing that makes this question hard, is that we know that there are lots of different versions out there. So Pat was talking earlier about the version we used prior to this version, and yet we know there are even more versions than that out there. And so I think depending on how long you've been using it, the consistency between it and the most recent version will vary.
Right.
Great, thanks. Here's another question. Is there a TPOT for infant-toddler observation?
Well, there isn't a TPOT for infant-toddler classrooms. We think that this TPOT is perfectly appropriate for toddler classrooms if the majority of the children are 2. We think below that it's not. We have developed a tool that we refer to as the TPOT, which stands for the Teaching Pyramid Infant Toddler Observation System. But we haven't had funding to really study that tool yet, and so it's not readily available. But it's on our list of things to do.
Great, thanks. We have another listener who's asking, is the TPOT effective in inclusive classrooms?
This is Lisa.
Well,
absolutely. I think that was the design, and the intention is that you would be able to use it for inclusive classrooms. But Mary Louise, do you have a different perspective?
Oh no, I was going to say the same. I was going to say that the purpose of this model, the pyramid model, is to address the needs of all children in any preschool classroom, and so it's designed to address the needs of children who are at risk, children who are typically developing, children who have disabilities, children who don't have problem behaviors, children who do. So we've primarily used it in inclusive classrooms, although we have used it in some self-contained classrooms.
Great, thanks. We have a question about timeline for using the TPOT. So when conducting this tool, is there a timeline in which administrators should follow so that the implementation and discussion with teachers directly impacts student learning? So I can reread that if you need. I know that was a longer question. Basically, is there a timeline that you recommend administrators follow so that the feedback impacts student learning?
So this is Lisa. The timeline is going to be a challenging question to answer because the TPOT can be used in so many different service settings. So it could be used in classrooms that are year-round. We've used it quite a bit here in Florida within child care environments, and they operate year-round. And then we have, classrooms for young children that operate on a school calendar. I think what's important is the notion of what can we do with the TPOT and planning professional development and thinking about that. And so if you were on an academic calendar, the administrator may think about doing TPOTs early on to get a read on where are teachers in the implementation of practices. And then looking at those data using the spreadsheet will help you target both teachers who are in a good place and really have many of the practices, teachers who might have more support needs, as well as you might identify some common areas that will be really good to stage maybe group professional development with follow-up coaching. So do it early on and then plan your support, your coaching support, and your other professional development activities based on a real careful analysis of where you see your teachers are.
Great, thanks. Okay, has the TPOT been used outside of the Head Start classrooms? For example, in a classroom that follows a constructionist approach to learning?
Well, the TPOT's been used, we've used it in every kind of early childhood setting you could imagine. So from public school to child care to Head Start. I don't think the setting is really the issue. So the point is about, is the philosophy of the classroom a constructivist approach? And I mean, Pat and Lisa, y'all jump in here. Generally speaking, we think that the practices that are in the pyramid are good, developmentally appropriate practices that should be going on in all classrooms regardless of what approach is used. I don't know, do y'all agree?
Absolutely.
Yes. And I think the targeted teaching practices, if we wanted to frame them within a developmentally appropriate practices framework, we'd think about intentional teaching.
Yeah.
At the targeted and individualized level.
Great, thanks. We have a question that's someone submitted during the registration. So what's the best way to start using TPOT at my program?
Well, I mean, so one of the things I talked a little bit about is directing our an early childhood program, and I think that the TPOT shouldn't be used in the absence of kind of a program-wide commitment to implementing the pyramid model. And so generally speaking, the TPOT should be seen as a tool that helps teachers do that better. And we think that the vast majority of teachers need coaching around pyramid model practices. Our data would suggest that they do. And so I think the way to get started is for a program to make a commitment to implementing the pyramid model and then using the TPOT to plan professional development in the way that Lisa was talking about just a few minutes ago.
Great, thanks. Let's see. So we have a question about research. Has there been any research on the impact of scores on this and a teacher's effectiveness in the classroom?
Well, some of the data.
Pat, let me see. Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Pat.
I think the data that Mary Louise showed with respect to teachers' fidelity of implementation of the practices in response to the professional development that was received is a way of measuring, getting at one dimension of teaching effectiveness, because we would assert that teachers implementing these practices with quality, which we talked about earlier on the webinar, is what the measure is designed to help support and measure the quality with which teachers are implementing these practices. We know that if teachers are implementing these practices with quality, then it's more likely that they're going to be effective in terms of promoting young children's social emotional competence and preventing and addressing challenging behavior.
Great, thanks. I think we'll take one final question here. Let's see. Are there strategies offered if you get a no on an item? If there are, can you share where to access them? And if not, are there other resources that you recommend?
Yeah, so actually there's a lot of resources, and Amy, we might give you these links to send in the follow-up email.
Sure.
So the TPOT itself has really explicit guidance around each indicator, and so that provides you some information about what people need to do, if you will, to get credit for an indicator. I think the inventory of practices that someone asked about earlier is a really good place to go get more specific examples of practices. On both the TAXI and CEPHL websites, and Amy, these are the links that you can send to people.
Okay.
There is a wealth of information both for teachers as well as trainers, as well as actually thinking about sharing this information with families. There's a wealth of information on those two websites that would be directly related to learning to implement the practices.
Great, thanks. And I'll make sure to add the 2 links to those centers' websites in the email, and then I'll also add the link where you can download the scoring spreadsheet.
Yeah, and those websites, most everything you would want off those websites are at no cost. They're free to download.
Great, yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I know people appreciate that. Okay, so thank you all so much for joining us. Thanks to our presenters and thanks to all of our listeners. As I mentioned earlier, we recorded the webinar and the Q&A session, and we'll send a link in the email tomorrow, so feel free to share it with any of your colleagues who might not have been able to join us today. We really appreciated everyone joining us today, so thank you very much and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.